Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is John Roberti, and today's topic is what's it like inside? Reflections on a career as an in-house lawyer. In the antitrust law section generally, but also as we think about legal careers, there are a number of different options. And we have in the past on this podcast talked to government lawyers and private practitioners about what it's like to do what they do. Today, we wanted to dedicate an entire podcast to thinking about what it's like to be an inside lawyer. How are the challenges different, and how do you confront them, and why is it a good experience for some people? So we're going to do that today with a friend of the podcast who spent a number of years in-house, and see what we can learn. With me today is my friend and the co-chair of the Curious Amalgam podcast, Christina Ma. Hi, Christina.
Hi. Hey, John.
Christina, what are we doing today?
So as you've previewed, we'll be talking with a friend of the section, a member of the section, about the ins and outs of being in-house counsel.
Great. And who's our guest today?
So Steve Cernak is our guest today. He is partner at Bona Law in Detroit, Michigan, and previously served as an in-house antitrust counsel for General Motors for over 20 years. Steve also previously worked as of counsel for Schiff Hardin and has taught and lectured on antitrust topics and about being in-house counsel at various institutions, including the Thomas M. Cooley Law School, Wayne State University, and the University of Michigan. Steve, as we've previewed, is an active member of the section and in the community, serving as a member of the Antitrust Council for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're very excited to have him. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here. Long-time listener, first-time guest.
So, Steve, many of our listeners will at one point in time either have a choice to become or contemplate becoming an in-house counsel for a company. Now, if you can sort of recall going back many years ago, not that many years, but many years ago, to when you graduated law school, tell us a little bit about why you decided to go in-house and what other professional opportunities you were considering.
Sure. So yes, it was many years ago. You don't need to qualify that. I was, when I was in law school, I was also getting an advanced degree in economics. And I knew that I wanted to do something with the law, but also involving business. When I was in law school, I certainly had no idea that I wanted to go in-house versus being outside or anything like that. Just wanted to do something involving business. But after my first year of law school, in order to save money, I needed to stay and live with my parents in the Detroit area. So I was looking for a job in the Detroit area, and so I was able to get a job with the General Motors legal staff after my first summer, and they were very excited to get me because. With my economics background, they thought I'd be a nice fit with what was at the time the antitrust section of the GM legal staff, and so I sort of fell into that. Decided that wow, this was exactly what I was looking for. A chance to use my economics background to work with business and to work with my legal background. So for my second summer, I stayed in-house. And decided that yes, I wanted to stay in house, but that cars were more exciting than insurance, and so that I ended up staying at General Motors on a full-time basis when I graduated from the University of Michigan.
And were your peers also looking in-house? What was the conversation like when you were talking to your colleagues at the time about the choice of going in-house, working for the government, going to a law firm?
Yeah, I know. I think it was at the time it was highly unusual to go in house, especially out of law school, and it was sort of thought that going in house was sort of either selling out. That is, you were not going to be getting the same kind of exciting legal work if you went in house. I'm glad I did not listen to those people because I found that it was very exciting. Certainly, at least at General Motors. Um, and as I was graduating, by that time I was only looking to go in house. My fiance, now wife, at the time had job offers from law firms in Detroit and Chicago. I was able to get a job offer from AT&T in Chicago. We decided to stay in Detroit.
And you had mentioned, having an experience in-house at an insurance company. You had an opportunity at AT&T and also GM. Cars were sexier than insurance. But what about GM as an employer, as a legal office, made GM more appealing than other in-house shops?
Well, by the time I got to General Motors as a summer student, I had not taken an antitrust class. I still spelled it with a hyphen at that time. But I got to know the area of the law really well. And when I got the offer to go back as a full-time basis, it was to be one of the antitrust lawyers there.
I see.
To go back to Travelers or to AT&T, I would have been doing some other area of the law. By the time I was graduating from law school, I decided that antitrust law was the right combination for me, the right combination of law and business and my economics background.
Right. Sounded like a unique opportunity that presented itself.
Yes.
So Steve,
go ahead.
I was just gonna ask you. So Steve, you spent this time sort of growing into this role. Tell us about what are the pressures on an in-house lawyer that might be different than the pressures on somebody maybe working in a law firm. I mean, for example, young associates working in a law firm think a lot about billable hours. I think that's probably less of an issue for an in-house lawyer, but how are the pressures different?
Yeah, no billable hours requirements at all. In fact, there was, we spent a couple weeks at General Motors one time actually keeping track of our hours, and we all decided that we hated it. And that a lot of people who had come in from outside said, this is why I came inside. So I didn't need to keep track of billable hours. So those pressures are gone. On the other hand, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There are all kinds of questions that come in on a regular basis. And certainly given technology, sometimes after hours or after hours here in the Eastern time zone of the United States, if you're dealing with clients who are sitting in Europe or sitting in Asia. And those questions come in constantly. And so the volume of questions is just so much higher in-house. One of my predecessors at General Motors was Tom Leary, who later went on to become a commissioner at the FTC. And I forget the exact quote, but I think Tom was talking to somebody who was heading up the antitrust division saying, I deal with more antitrust issues in a day than you deal with in a month or something along those lines. A lot of those issues might be the same, but you still need to keep track of that volume, and it's huge.
It is. And I think as you think about the skill sets that are required, I think you also, there are people who can be very successful in law firms that are thinkers. They're able to go and they're maybe write a brief or put together a beautiful draft and be very, very successful in delivering really great service to their clients. I think those are important skills, but I think you tell me, but I would think an in-house lawyer would also have to be able to manage the many different things coming at him or her, and manage also the people issues that have to arise.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. One of my bosses. Well, I'll back up and say that I've been active in the ABA antitrust law section, since I started back in the late '80s, and have been active in the leadership since 1996, I think. I've been active in General Motors. Definitely supported that. But not everybody at General Motors legal staff thought that was such a great idea. And one of my bosses used to make fun of me when I was going off to ABA meetings and saying, well, so you're just going to go off and think big thoughts. Because that was not the sort of thing that we did on a regular basis. But we did do that at some times as well. General Motors is famous for working with Henry Manny and Bob Bork and others in the antitrust world, and trying to change the way that people viewed antitrust law in the 70s and 80s. But no, for the most part, you need to be able to react quickly and provide some good, actionable advice in plain English quickly, and yet also be able to recognize, those few situations when, no, you need a little more time, you need to do a little more research, you need to talk to somebody else, and you need to have developed enough, trust and respect from your clients, so that they will allow, those rare occasions when you do need a little more time before you're providing some good advice.
As you think about some choices that you've made, Steve, what is the profile of a lawyer that will be very successful in-house? And like I said, there are lots of different ways to achieve success, of course, but what are some of the characteristics you think that are important for an in-house lawyer?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you need to be prepared to. First you need to be a good lawyer, and so that's sort of a baseline. But beyond that, you do need to be able to handle a large volume of legal requests coming in on a regular basis. You need to, I think, enjoy business generally. You're going to be embedded with a number of business people. You're not going to be just surrounded by lawyers. Yes, you might be sitting, on the floor with the legal staff, but you're going to be, having lunch on a regular basis with others who are not lawyers and involved in business, who are living and breathing that business. So you need to, have a good understanding of the business world, and you need to enjoy that as well. And then it's also, as I sort of hinted at early on, it's also good to enjoy the business, that your company, your actual client is in. So for me, growing up in the Detroit area, cars are in the air, figuratively, and so I grew up, going to the dealership at the turn of every model year. Because that's what you do in Detroit. Cars are an interesting business, and so you've got to enjoy that particular business that your client is in as well. If you don't, you're not going to be as happy doing it, and you're probably not going to be as good doing it as well.
And what are some of the issues that an in-house lawyer may face in the antitrust or consumer protection world, that maybe you wouldn't see as typically in the outside bar?
Robinson Patman is not dead. So that's one of the reasons why I've written on Robinson Patman. But yes, it's very limited, but it's an example of a kind of, a part of the antitrust laws that, yes, generates very little true litigation these days, but is often part of the negotiations between a seller and a buyer, a seller and a retailer normally. And so as the in-house lawyer, you will need to support lots of different people around the business, including for instance the buyers, but perhaps the salespeople as well, depending on which business you're in. And you'll need to understand, those rare occasions when, at least these days under the current law, when Robinson Patman is a real concern, and the other times when it's not. And so you need to be able to understand that, and help your client through that. On sort of the other end, I would put mergers. That is, merger review can be thought of as a real subspecialty for people, sitting in Washington, D.C., and only those people file Hart-Scott-Rodinos and the like. Well, if your company is a serial buyer, and or in my case with General Motors during the 90s, a serial seller, you need to get to know the merger law as well, and the whole merger review process. So, for instance, I've filed dozens a year of Hart-Scott-Rodino filings. So I needed to know that kind of process as well. It's kind of even if your company doesn't do a lot of mergers, as the antitrust lawyer, you'll be expected to know everything about all areas of the antitrust law or competition law around the globe. And so you'll need to at least have some understanding of all of those other areas, and you don't get the opportunity to sort of specialize in a particular area of antitrust law.
Yeah, in-house counsels are often described as jack of all trades. And I guess even if you're an antitrust in-house counsel, you're sort of jack of all trades in all things antitrust, whether that be Robinson Patman or compliance or merger control.
Mm-hmm.
So, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about perhaps one of the more challenging experiences you had while in-house, most rewarding experience you had while at GM?
Well, I think for challenging, I'll go with the with all of the legal issues surrounding the General Motors bankruptcy, 2008, 2009. So at the time, at least, I'm not sure about now, but it's the largest bankruptcy, and yet it officially it went through in 30 days, 45 days. Unofficially, there were a number of us that were working it practically full time for many months. So challenging in the respect that you didn't know you were going to have a job at the end of this process. It seemed like almost literally the world was falling apart. And yet there was an awful lot of work to do. You needed to work with a lot of people internal to General Motors, but also external. At the time, it was government employees and advisors to the government, people who were not familiar with a lot of the ins and outs of the auto industry. And you needed to be part of the team, and yet part of the team that was hopefully keeping the company alive. And we talk about bet the company litigation or mergers. Oh, this was the bet the company bankruptcy. So for me, there were two big issues. I always did antitrust within General Motors for the 20 plus years. And so the antitrust issue was kind of an odd one. Technically, this was General Motors Corporation being purchased by General Motors Company. General Motors Company was, at the time, controlled by the U.S. government. That does not generate a Hart-Scott-Rodino filing for technical reasons, and yet it would have required a pre-merger filing in many jurisdictions around the globe, like, for instance, Russia. Well, if you remember back to 2008, 2009, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of appetite amongst the buyers here to allow the Russian government to, opine as to whether this deal should go through or not. And so I needed to work with the government lawyers and others to explain to the regulators around the globe that we didn't think that the filing was going to be made here, but certainly after General Motors Company is in business, we will continue to be making filings, and we'll observe those. And then the other challenging part, at the time, I was also doing work in the service area, which meant warranty statements and lemon law cases and the like. And there was some bright ideas that perhaps we could, leave all of our warranty responsibilities behind in bankruptcy so that we'd have, just one less liability. And we finally prevailed upon the buyers to say that would probably destroy General Motors' reputation in the marketplace if we walked away from all of our warranty liabilities, including lemon law cases, in the same way that General Motors Company walked away from General Motors Corporation's product liability cases. So, needing to work on sort of the business issues on that part of it as well was rather challenging.
Steve, we've often sort of given advice to younger lawyers, I have at least, that if you're going to advise a client, you need to keep your answer to the size of the average iPhone screen, so somebody doesn't have to scroll. How do you communicate with your clients in a way that delivers that advice in a practical way? How do you develop those skills?
Yeah, you are. I don't know if you're slightly younger than I am, but I think of it as an email and on a computer, and it can't go more than one screen. They can't scroll down. So yes, that's usually a paragraph or so. You need that is a skill. That is something that you do need to practice. That's not something easy. You do need to be willing to give an answer. The answer could be yes, it could be no.
Right. And
yes, you want to caveat that answer as best you can, but you need to be able to speak in succinct phrases and provide actionable advice in a very short period of time or space or whatever. And that's something that is difficult to do, and yet you need to practice at it and get good at it, but you also need to be able to at some point say, okay, but this one, I need to go on to the second paragraph. This one, I need to go a little bit longer. And so I need to explain why, I need to go on a little bit longer. But, that takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, I think the big difference a lot of times when I particularly work with younger lawyers when we're trying to develop advice for a client, they want to tell me about all the different weighing that they would want to do and how they would think about the problem. And here's this risk here. It's the issue spotting that they learned how to do in law school. Okay. And they've spotted all the issues. I think when you're giving advice to a client, particularly when you're in-house, the client just wants to know the answer. Just, can I do it or not? And
the way I've told younger lawyers or again, law students, as I've taught classes on being an in-house lawyer, you don't want to explain everything you know. You want to give to the client everything she needs to know. Assume that she loves her job, tell her what she needs to know, and let her get back to it. And that's all.
It's funny because when you write a brief, you're kind of doing the same thing. I mean, you have a little more space, but it's really important to hone on it. So it's a similar skill. I just think for an in-house lawyer, it's a skill that is just even more magnified, that you've got to explain something that's complicated to somebody in a simple and definitive way. And I guess the other big difference that I would see is you have to give a real answer. By the time it gets to the in-house lawyer and they're going to give advice to the client, they can lay out the choices for the client, but in the end, the client really needs to know, what are we doing here?
I agree with all that. One advantage, though, that the in-house counsel usually has is many more opportunities to, quote unquote, train the client, train the people that they're dealing with. And by train, I mean, okay, yes, officially, training, and whether online or in person, but also just to have the conversations with these people so that they understand where you're coming from, so that when you do give the one line, bit of advice, or if it's really lengthy, one paragraph, you've built up with them, the trust and respect, but you've also built up with them, their substantive understanding of that area of the law, because you've had a lot more opportunities to deal with them. That's one of the differences that I see with being an outside counsel now is that I often don't have that same kind of relationship. I've not spent hours or years with some of these people, and yet I still need to provide some good actionable advice.
All right, Steve. Let's shift gears slightly. I don't often like to talk about the podcast on the podcast. It gets a little meta for me, but Steve, you were there at the beginning, and I think at this now it's not a bad time to just sort of reflect on what were we trying to do in the beginning. I think when we
You've often wondered that what the heck was Roberti trying to do?
But well, I think one of the things that I think is important that I know you and I have talked about is that the podcast is really about trying to reach out to new people, to people that are members of the section that aren't necessarily as involved as they could be. Can you were the marketing officer, now you're the committee officer at the section. Can you speak a little bit to that about how we are using the podcast and other things to try to reach out to people and sort of expand the tent?
Yeah, I think we thought that the podcast would be a great way to reach a new group of people, whether those people are members or not, and hopefully they would become members and get more involved in the antitrust law section, and to reach them in a different way. And so we needed to reach them in a way that they were comfortable and that they enjoyed consuming that content to use the marketing buzzwords. And so what we were looking for was trying to approach a different kind of member in a different way and make antitrust law and consumer protection and data privacy something that they would enjoy hearing more about. So it's not just reading law review articles. It's not just something that they do for a living, but it's something that that they do because it's interesting to them. And so hopefully the podcast, and I think this has happened, we'll touch on slightly different angles on the same sort of subjects that they do for their day job, but in a way that's different and that is interesting and new.
All right. Well, then let me ask you the question that I have asked every single guest that has been on the podcast since we started. Steve, tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know about you if we only knew you professionally.
Yeah, fortunately, since I myself have listened to every last one of these podcasts, I should be prepared for that. I think I would say that what others might not understand is how important the sport of baseball has been to me. That is, I grew up with older sisters. I'd like to remind them that they're much older than I am. But that meant I went to an awful lot of softball games because they were all softball players. My mother listened to the Detroit Tigers games every night. I was fortunate enough to play on several state championship teams in high school. So playing 100 games a year or so for a long period of time. Coached my three sons' baseball teams for about 16 years. So not quite as many games managed as Tim Muris from an earlier episode, but pretty close. And also I'm now I have been a partial season ticket holder to the Detroit Tigers. So I've been to Comerica Park. The listeners won't be able to see the picture of Comerica Park behind me.
It is a podcast, Steve.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I've been to, Comerica Park, 40 or 50 times a year since 2004. So I've spent a lot of time living and breathing baseball.
And is that your favorite place to watch a baseball game, or do you have a favorite stadium?
Yeah, no, I really do like Comerica Park, and it's sort of sacrilegious to like Comerica Park better than Tiger Stadium. But the dirty little secret is that Tiger Stadium, was very close. The seats were very close to playing area, but otherwise the seats were not that comfortable. The amenities were not comfortable. Comerica Park is a beautiful place to be in the summer. It's also nice there to be in October. You might need to wear extra clothes, and I hope to have that opportunity again at some point.
So, Steve, I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I grew up going to Veterans Stadium. And the one thing I'm sure that Comerica Park doesn't have that the Vet always had was a jail in the basement.
No, I think there was one at Tiger Stadium, but no. I don't think there is one at Comerica Park, and I hope not to confirm that.
All right. So, and getting back to your experience management, you said you've managed all these games and et cetera. How many times have you been tossed?
Oh, none. But I think there were many times when the umpires would have liked that. I've been known to chirp at the home plate umpire and think that I've got a better view, even though I am way off on the side. But I can at least tell whether the pitch was high or low. And so, yes, my kids have heard me say it sure wasn't low numerous times.
Well, that is an impressive streak of not being tossed. Let's go to our final segment. We call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
Look, Steve, you've listened to every episode, so you know what I'm going to say. We don't have a hat, okay? Aren't together. We don't have a hat. So what I have is a list of questions, and they're numbered 1 to 25. I'm going to ask you to choose a number. I'm going to choose that. Okay? There's no hat.
I was hoping to be able to do that spiel all by myself, but you do it much better than I would have. Okay, so I will go with Al Kaline and choose number 6.
Question number 6. What was your very first job?
There were 2. One was in the summer jobs. Again, I spent a lot of time playing baseball, and so I was playing. That felt like a job after a while. But I worked midnights in a gas station. So a convenience store / gas station. So needed to stock the cigarette shelves and stock the milk shelves, and otherwise, deal with the drunks who came in after the bars closed at 2 a.m. And then also worked laying sod and cutting grass, sort of around my home. That was a job when I was sort of in my best shape ever. I actually had shoulder muscles for a change.
Do you have any tips for our listeners on the best way to lay sod?
Protect your back because those sod balls are pretty heavy. And then, yes, you need to, tuck them in, make sure that they're actually touching each other and actually sort of go underneath each other, because you don't want to leave any seams in between the various sod balls as you roll them out.
And since you've raised the convenience store, I think this is fair game. Steve, Twinkies or Ho-Hos?
I think Twinkies, but I would go with Hostess fruit pies, which at least here in the Midwest was a big deal. To have access to Hostess fruit pies, on a regular basis, that made 3 a.m. worthwhile.
What flavor?
Apple, but they used to have a French apple.
French apple,
which it just had a little bit of cinnamon. If I could get the French apple pie, that was a great night.
And just for our listeners in France, just because it's cinnamon doesn't necessarily mean it's French. It's an American thing.
Yes.
All right. With that, Steve, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.